Good morning, everybody. It is Tuesday, July 13th. It's just after 9 in the morning. I'm on my first break of work and I wanted to come on to start off this reading vlog for Evercrossed. This is getting into the second half of the 6 books that are in this series. If you haven't been following me in my reading vlog reviews of this series, of this reread series I've been doing, I'll leave a link for the playlist in the cards and in the description for you guys. But for those of you that have been with me for a while, a quick recap. This series dedicates itself to the story of Ivy and Tristan. Ivy is, at the beginning of the first story, a high school junior, senior, something like that, and she and her boyfriend Tristan have been together for quite some time, and unfortunately they get in a car accident and he dies. The first book essentially goes from the accident and jumps back to essentially how they met and how their relationship blossomed, and then it goes back to the accident and she finds out that he has unfortunately died. And we learn throughout the second and third book that Tristan's still kind of around. He's basically an angel, and he finds out that his purpose before he's able to cross over is to protect Ivy, because they realize that the accident that they were in may not have been truly an accident and may have been something that was much more sinister. At the third book, you learn who exactly was behind it. This is going to also now contain spoilery content, and the rest of this video will contain spoilery content for Evercrossed, so I would recommend that if you are watching this video that you have read all 3 of the original books that were published in the 1990s, and also read Evercrossed, which was published in the 2010s, before you watch the rest of this video. So now that with the disclaimer out of the way, you find out in the third book, the third and final book of the original trilogy that was written in the 1990s, that Ivy's stepbrother Gregory was the one who was behind the accident that Ivy and Tristan were in, because he was trying to kill Ivy. There's essentially a lot of jealousy surrounding around the fact that Ivy married into Gregory's family. There's a lot surrounding around him in terms of his lineage, with the fact that his father wasn't actually really his father in any way. He was more of his stepfather who didn't treat him properly. His mother had a lot of really kind of nasty secrets that were being kept from him. You learn that her death may also not have been an accident like it was told in the beginning of the first book, and there's a lot of stuff essentially that you learned that building up to this point was not great. And ever since Tristan's death, Gregory had basically been weeding his way into Ivy's life in order to kind of gain her trust, and through that you learn that she ended up kind of falling for him in a sense. It also was affecting her friendships, because her best friend Susanna was basically in this on-again, off-again relationship with Gregory, and constantly thought that Ivy was trying to beat her out of this relationship, and it caused a lot of massive rifts. And then when Gregory is found out to be the one that is causing all of these problems, and he's the reason why not only did his mother die, but also Tristan's death, you start to kind of piece things back together as to like things that didn't quite make sense up until that point. But the end of the third book essentially has Gregory falling off of a bridge, I think, and basically dying. Something essentially happens and he dies. This book then takes place a year after the accident, so most of the original trilogy took place within the coming months after the accident itself. This is now a full year since the accident, and it's been several months since Gregory's death, and there's a lot of stuff that's changed in terms of Ivy and like what she views and all these things, because the biggest problem that was happening was in the original trilogy, Ivy had this love for angels. She believed in angels, she believed in a guardian angel, and then when Tristan died, she lost a lot of that, and over the course of the series, you saw she was starting to get that kind of back, especially when she realized that Tristan was a guardian angel. So this takes place, like I said, a year after the initial accident, and I don't remember much of what happens in this particular series, because the last 3 books in this were all published in like 2011, around that time. So about 20 years passed between the final story within the original trilogy and the beginning of this one. So there's a lot of stuff that could change in terms of the writing style, the way that the characters are built. It's still fairly short, but I don't know if that does in any way affect the way that the writing is. I feel like this is going to go basically the same way Thirst did, where the second part of the series was pretty good and actually got better than the original did. But the original series, I gave 4 stars to, and I think a 3-star maybe to like the original 3 books. I don't remember exactly how that went, but they were all above a 3-star at the very least. So I have the same feeling that this is going to happen for this part. But the synopsis basically says that it's been a year since Ivy's boyfriend Tristan died. They both moved on, Tristan to the other side of the afterlife, and Ivy to sweet, dependable Will, who Will was a character we saw many times in the series, and he was a character who kind of had this unrequited love for Ivy, but Ivy wasn't willing to move on with him because she still was in love with Tristan. Now Ivy's heading to Cape Cod, hoping to leave the horror of last summer behind. She wants nothing more than to lie on the beach, sip lemonade, and hang out with her friends. But then a car crash ends Ivy's life. As she floats to the beyond, looking down on the life she's left behind, Tristan breathes life back into her with a passionate kiss. She wakes up in the hospital surrounded by Will and her family. Still, all she could think about is the love that she lost. But memories aren't all that's come back from the past, and this time Ivy's not sure love will be enough to save her. Okay, now I remember a little bit more of what this one was. So yeah, she does, based on the synopsis, end up dying herself. She ends up actually dying in an accident very similar to how Tristan's death was, and there's a lot of crazy stuff that happens from there. So I'm pretty interested to see how this goes. Now, for most of my reading vlog reviews, I go about 100 pages before I end up talking about, you know, the story, what I think of it, all those things. But like I said, this book is fairly short, so it's not going to be very often that I do that. And I don't know what happened to my book, but I somehow got blue paint on the pages, and I don't know how that ended up happening. That must have happened at some point, like while it was stored away, before I found these again and was like, oh, I want to reread these. Or maybe that was what happened when I picked it up from a used bookstore. I don't remember. But this book is about 278 pages. So essentially what will happen is I'll come back when I reach page 100, reach page 200, and then when I finish the book, because it will have been a good 70 some pages since the last time I check in. So yeah, we'll talk about kind of what my thoughts are, how the story's going, what's going on, and kind of comparing it in a lot of ways to how the original trilogy is. So hope you guys are excited to come along the ride with me. Okay guys, so it's a little bit later in the day. It is about 12:40, and I've reached 100 pages of, a little bit more than 100 pages of Evercrossed. We're on page 103, chapter 10. So let's go through quickly everything that's happened, which I will say I think is going a lot faster than I even expected it to be. I did not realize I was going to be able to pretty much read the entirety of this through the audiobook on Scribd for most of the day. I did start a little bit of it like reading physically, but then with work I decided I was going to switch to the audiobook because it was available on Scribd, and so it's really short. Like the audiobook I think is less than 6 hours, and as of now I'm a little more than 3.5 hours left of it, and I'm listening to it on 1.8 speed. So yeah, I think before I even finish my work day today, this is going to be done. But what has happened is we start off Evercrossed with a prologue, which is through some mystery individual, but somebody who's very hell-bent on vengeance. And I know who that is, but I don't want to say it yet because it hasn't actually been revealed. So once, you know, we get to revealing it, I'll say it. But somebody very malevolent is seeking vengeance. So then we start off the book on chapter 1, where Ivy, Beth, and Beth's cousins Kelsey and Danya are on the beach in this area of Cape Cod because over the summer, which is the summer before Ivy and Beth go to college, they decide to go to this inn that Beth's aunt owns and help out there over the summer and kind of give them like a working job while also end up, you know, just having a good time on the beach of Cape Cod. At one point, it's starting to get really stormy, so they decide to go back inside, and Kelsey and Danya decide that they're gonna play with a Ouija board because they're fucking stupid, basically. And the thing is we know at this point that Beth, ever since the beginning of Kissed by an Angel, has been able to communicate with spirits. She is a bit of a psychic, a bit of a medium kind of thing, and so obviously this is scary for her. At this point, we know that Tristan's no longer around. We talk about multiple times over the course of these chapters that after Tristan saved Ivy from Gregory in the end of the last book, that he essentially fulfilled his mission and he went into the the light. So he is supposedly no longer around. Now, when the girls start playing with the Ouija board, some really scary things happen. Going into chapter 2, Will comes in because he is set up somewhere else from the girls. They're separated, and so he comes over to the cottage that they're in to check on all of them, and they start picking up all of the debris and everything. And then the next day we see Beth still kind of feeling weird, but she starts talking about how also here in this area is a guy that she used to grow up with that she had a huge crush on. And honestly, from first interaction with Ivy and Will, he's kind of a D-bag, like a really big D-bag, and he clearly wants to not be involved with anybody other than Beth, but he almost makes it as if like Beth is kind of beneath him and like he could do so much better already. And then we start seeing a little bit at the end of this chapter about Ivy's attachment to Tristan still, even after he's already like moved on into the light. And it's because unfortunately with Ivy, their relationship really didn't last altogether that long. But the amount of time that they did spend together, like, he's the only person she ever really had, like, strong feelings for, which I can relate a lot to that with the way that my husband and I are. Like, where when I was about her age and I had started dating Robert, you know, I saw myself with him for the rest of my life. I saw him as somebody that, you know, I would never want to be with anybody else because the relationship that we developed was so loving and it was so pure and simple. And after losing Tristan, Ivy was incredibly depressed for months, and it was really hard for her to move on. And when Will started showing his affection for her, she got really scared because she wasn't ready to move on, and she was not willing to let herself love again because she had lost Tristan. And even though now she and Will have been dating longer than she and Tristan were together, it's still really scary for her to fully let go of Tristan. And so there's this kind of inner turmoil that you start seeing over the course of this story. And when it comes to chapter 3, they start working through the inn, all of that, and it's getting to be really busy because it's a weekend during the summer, so more people are there. And Aunt Cindy, who is the owner of the inn, tells Ivy that there is this church where that they are letting her go and play the piano because Ivy's a huge pianist. They're like, you know, just let them know that you're going to be over there. You can go use it anytime while you're here for the summer. And so she goes and starts playing a song that Tristan loved hearing her play, which was Moonlight Sonata. And Will comes and surprises her, and you can kind of tell he's really hurt. Mostly because he wants Ivy to love him, and he knows that she does care for him, but he has this kind of feeling that she's never going to love him the way that she loved Tristan. But then Beth comes up to her and is like, dude, I need your help. My cousins are at some party in Chatham, and they're drunk as hell, and we need to go pick them up before my Aunt Cindy finds out and goes freaking bananas. Unfortunately, because of that, though, Ivy and Beth get into a car accident, which, if you know anything about this series up to this point, car accidents are pretty common for Miss Ivy. Unfortunately, chapter 4, we do realize that Ivy actually dies, which, as we saw in the synopsis, was already told. She does die, and she sees Tristan for the first time in several months since Gregory had been killed, essentially, after he fell off the bridge and died. Tristan, though, says that even from here, it's really hard for me to move on, but you have to go. You have to go back to your life. And so he lets her go, and she wakes up in the hospital. And then she's being, in chapter 5, questioned by the police, and her mom comes out to see her and her little brother Philip, and Beth and Will are there as well. In chapter 6, she's still in the hospital for a little bit. Kelsey and Danya come by, and they kind of apologize for what happened, but they're like, we're still gonna go out and party and stuff, and you're more than welcome to join. We're just sorry, basically, that you got an accident on the way to come get us. So, like, very insincere is what it sounds like. And they keep talking about how they need to get Beth to come out and party with them because they don't like the fact that Beth hangs around Ivy and Will so much, and Beth needs to get her own boyfriend, all these things, and Ivy's not really like that into it. She thinks Beth's just fine the way she is, and that these girls are kind of just a little ridiculous. Then they start talking about this other person in the hospital who has massive amnesia, and he's kind of violent. He's very attractive looking underneath all of his bruises and stuff, but they don't really know much other than that about the fact that he has amnesia. Chapter 7, she gets released from the hospital, and she ends up going back to the inn for a little bit, and she starts talking to Beth about the idea that she doesn't really know whether Tristan actually saved her or not. She keeps talking to Beth, and she's like, when you saw me in the car and were screaming, you thought I was dead, right? And Beth was kind of like, yeah, I guess. And what happens is that when Ivy comes back into her body, the cut that she has on her head like almost completely like disappears. She doesn't seem to have any broken bones. Like, it's truly a miracle that she even got out of that, because the car essentially had flipped and rolled. And so everyone was shocked that Ivy wasn't seriously hurt. Well, Ivy thinks that that's because Tristan actually ended up saving her, and she believes that he is the reason she is still alive. And Beth, I think, just is kind of not willing to admit that that's possible, because she's just really scared, and she doesn't still really know how to handle her psychic abilities or anything. And so she's like, that's not possible. Just with the anniversary of his death coming up, things are coming really crazy, and I just can't believe that this is actually happening. And then she meets up with Will and Philip, who are out kayaking. She says that she had basically prayed to Tristan to save her, and Philip's like, well, that's not possible because I haven't heard from him since Gregory died, so he must be gone. But we could talk to Lacey, who is another angel that hasn't moved on, that was really helping Tristan with fulfilling his mission. And Lacey and Ivy, at this point, if you haven't, read the other books, Lacey and Ivy have had quite a bit of a rough patch, because as it was shown in the previous books, Lacey was really starting to fall in love with Tristan and didn't understand why Tristan was holding so tightly onto Ivy and not moving on. And so she kind of still has this little bit of resentment for Ivy, because she couldn't get Tristan to love her like she was falling for him. And when they do call Lacey, Lacey's like, I wasn't the one that saved you. If he really did what you said he did, then he could possibly be in a huge amount of trouble, because what he would have done is called the kiss of life. And the kiss of life is something that people in his position, where they are passed over the veil, they're not allowed to do. That is like meddling in the lines of fate and meddling with God's plan. And then chapter 8, Will and Ivy have this conversation where Ivy seems to be very distant. She seems to be very kind of in her own world, and Will thinks it's because she's, traumatized from the event, because for God's sake, this girl has gone through so many tragic events in just the span of a year that he's starting to think she's starting to kind of break down, but is not willing to talk to anybody about it. And Will is really upset by that, because all he wants is to just help her. And she's like, I just need space from everybody. I need to kind of just be on my own for a little bit and kind of just process everything that's happened. And Will's obviously very hurt by that, because he loves her, he wants to take care of her, he wants to prove that, he's capable of loving her, all these things, and she's just really not sure of what to do. And then she goes back to the hospital to go do some tests to make sure she's doing okay, and she meets up with the guy that has amnesia, and he's like, you need to give me your car keys, I need to get out of here, all these things. And she's trying to figure out why he's so amped up, and he's like, you don't understand, you're not going to understand. I don't remember anything about what happened to me. I don't even know who I am, but I know I need to get out of this hospital. And so she does end up helping him. He basically says that the hospital calls him Guy, which is just another way for them to say like he's a John Doe, because he doesn't know who he is, and there was nothing indicating his identity on him when he was brought to the hospital. Ivy essentially gets him to leave the hospital. They are able to sneak him out, and then chapter 9 they start to try to like talk again, and like she tries to find out more about him what she can, and she decides that she wants to basically go and purchase some new clothes for him so that he has something decent to wear, because what he's wearing has been a little dirty for a while. And when she comes back to the car from purchasing the stuff, he's gone, and she's like, all right, whatever. So she puts it all in a bag, tosses it off to the side of the road in case he decides to go and grab it, and she just leaves. One thing I will say with this is there are a lot of modernizations to this story, because back in the original trilogy, which is supposed to be in the timeline a year before this stuff happens, there's not really a lot of mention about technology, because in the 90s there wasn't nearly as much technology as we have now. But now that this is come into a more modern age, having been published in 2011, there's like talk of iPods and iPhones, and so like obviously this has been modernized to where now like it would actually be a pretty contemporary based story for 2011. However, I think that like isn't 100% necessary. Like, it's nice to see that it's there to kind of make sure that the story is contemporized, but even the original trilogy, it would have been very easy for you to put that story into a more contemporary setting, even based on the writing and the language and everything, which, again, that's another consistent aspect of this story, is that the writing seems very similar, a little bit more freshened up, I guess, more than the 1990s story, but, you know, it's freshened up, it's a little bit more of a contemporary style, I guess, which, I mean, I can see a little bit of the difference, but there's not too much to where it's not the same story. Overall, not too bad, but like I said, it's very quick. I totally forgot how quick these books usually go, and so I think I'll be able to finish this by the end of the day today. And I'm fairly certain it's going to end up being like a 3 or a 4 star, depending on how the last 200 pages are, because I just don't know whether or not we're going to really get a satisfying ending for this part. I know that this character that is named Guy, he does have a huge part in this story, in this trilogy. I just can't seem to really remember how or why, but something's really like big about him, and honestly I'm kind of excited to see how this goes again, because the original trilogy obviously is much more memorable, but the second trilogy not so much, and so I'm kind of like excited to see where this whole thing goes and whether or not this does end up being a satisfying conclusion, because if I remember correctly, the final book in the overall series was not well received by myself or my younger sister when we finished the series, because of a certain event that I think was at the very end of the last book that we were like, really, that's how we go out, kind of thing. So I'm curious though if that's really at the end of that, or if it was at all possible we were misremembering and it was something that happened in like an earlier book as opposed to the very last one. I will come back again when we've reached page 200 mark, which for in here is going to be page 213. Oh wow, okay. Yeah, 213, and then we'll have the last like 60 some pages of the book to go before the end of it. So I'll get started with that and check in with you guys a little bit later. Okay, so we have just reached page 210. We are on now chapter 20 of this. So I don't have too much more to go. I have another probably 60 some odd pages. Chapter 10, we basically learn a little bit more about Kelsey and Danya and kind of like what they do, and essentially kind of like the kinds of people they are. Like, Kelsey's kind of your typical party girl. She's kind of, you know, not necessarily sleeping around per se, but, you know, she definitely is somebody who can't like stay in like a certain relationship because she just kind of bounces from guy to guy. Whereas Danya is a little bit less like that, still a party girl, but kind of is more interested in like one person at a time. She sits there for a little bit and Guy ends up showing up. And we hadn't seen Guy since he basically left the store that Ivy went into. They sit and they talk for a little bit, and it looks like he's got the bag that she had left for him and everything. And she offers him some food, and, you know, he comes in, and she's trying to figure out, like, if he's remembering anything, and he's unfortunately not. Chapter 11, he goes upstairs to take a shower and everything, and then Will comes back over. They, you know, meet for the first time, Guy and Will's kind of put off by Guy because he's another person, and obviously Will is very insecure about his relationship, so he kind of just doesn't seem to trust Guy right off the bat, which Ivy kind of doesn't understand that because he seems to be a pretty harmless guy. He just needs somebody to like help him because he's kind of just out on his own. Chapter 12, Beth asks if Guy might come back because Ivy and Will had talked and Will expressed his concern. Guy was basically gone, and she and Beth start talking about kind of the weirdness there is of Guy and how Will doesn't seem to trust them. Beth essentially starts talking to Ivy and saying that she's not really sure what's going on, but something really dangerous seems to be coming up and she's not sure what's happening. And then Will basically comes up with this idea of how since Tristan's anniversary of his death is coming up, he thinks it would be a really good idea to maybe host kind of a memorial for that on the beach. They all agree that it sounds wonderful. They're really excited about it. And then chapter 13, Guy shows up when Ivy has packed a bag for the beach to go to after she goes and does some practicing at the church that she is able to use their piano. And Guy decides to come along, and they meet the priest that runs the church. Guy ends up actually getting a job from him because he's like, I just need something to do. And Guy sits and listens to the music that Ivy plays, and when she plays Moonlight Sonata, which is Tristan's song, his favorite song, Guy is able to remember. He knows the song, he knows the composer, which is kind of strange, and he's like, I don't know why I know that. Then they decide to go to the beach and kind of just hang out. We learn that Guy's a little bit afraid of water, which could indicate that maybe the accident he was in that caused him to have amnesia was involved like in a drowning of some kind. We're not really sure. In chapter 14, Ivy drops Guy off somewhere else and then goes back to the inn. There's this big cookout going on where Danya and Kelsey have invited quite a few friends, and they just all kind of hang out and everything. And they kind of make fun of the fact that Will and Ivy are like kind of their one and only, that they're not willing to kind of just let the summer be the summer and hang out with a bunch of different people. They start talking about Guy, and they're starting to like ask questions of like, you know, what exactly happened to him. Nobody really knows who he is. And then this one guy, Brian, that is there kind of starts acting a little shady. He just kind of is like one of those guys that you just get a really bad vibe off of, that he's a player, that he's just kind of creepy, and you're just not really sure how to feel about it. Because specifically, he talks about how he plays hockey and he wants to invite Ivy for some private lessons, all while I'm pretty sure Will is still standing there and like with the rest of the group. So it was just very kind of creepy. So then chapter 15, after the party, you know, Will and Ivy the next day try to like make things work, because obviously there's been a lot of tension going on with this whole Guy thing, and also there's a lot of people that just have a really weird vested interest in Ivy, which I think is making them both feel uncomfortable. And so then what happens is when Ivy finishes up doing some piano work, Guy tells her, hey, I'm clearing out this barn to live in that, you know, the people that run the church are letting me use. Would you mind helping me with it? And while they're cleaning out the barn and stuff, Ivy starts having really strange feelings. She's starting to kind of piece together this thing that she's not sure if, you know, Guy is in any way supposed to be a version of Tristan that's come back to her or what, but she understands that the relationship she's building with Guy has a lot of similarities to the relationship she had with Tristan, and it's kind of starting to make her go a little berserk, honestly. So then Ivy goes back, and Will is pissed because they apparently had a date set up for that night, and Ivy completely forgets, and Will is really upset. So upset to the point that he basically breaks up with her because he's understood that Ivy's not really in this relationship as much as he is, and he's starting to also, I think, understand that this guy is kind of coming between the both of them, and he says that Ivy is basically using him as kind of a distraction to get away from him, because Will is not going to ever be Tristan, but because Guy is this weird, mysterious guy that seems to have something similar to what Tristan had or did or, you know, thought, you know, he thinks that Ivy is going to try to go for him, and, you know, they might as well just break it off so she can go do whatever's going to make her happy, because obviously he's not that. And Beth comes out and she's like, listen, I love you both so much, but you need to be careful. Guy does not seem all that he is. I don't know what it is about him, but he doesn't seem right, and I'm scared for you. And then she talks about that ever since the seance had happened at the beginning of the book, she's been having these dreams that she knows is Gregory. She believes that Gregory is somehow back, even though he died, and she thinks that based on these dreams and this feeling she's been having that she only had when Gregory was around, is that Gregory somehow is going to get revenge and avenge himself for his death. Beth's like, if that happens, you are literally going to need the entirety of heaven to help you, because it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be good. It's going to freaking suck, basically. So then chapter 17, Kelsey and Ivy start talking about kind of what's happened, and Kelsey kind of is basically just digging for information at this point. She's kind of one of those girls where she's just gonna dig and dig and dig for information that has nothing to do with her, and she will not let up unless you tell her the whole story, because she's gonna probably spread that around to a bunch of other people. And then Ivy starts talking to Lacey and tells her about Beth's dream, and Lacey is like, why the hell did you guys even do a seance? Because you both know that that's gonna like cause so many problems. You're both freaking stupid. And she says that basically if Gregory's back, there's a lot of stuff he can do now that he's basically a demon. Like, he could basically get inside people and either persuade them to do things, or he could actually like take over their bodies and force them to do things that would be incredibly dangerous. Lacey says, Ivy, if Tristan did give you the kiss of life, he's in deep trouble. Don't try to contact him. Don't tempt him. You've already gotten him killed. Don't damn him forever. Ivy tries to kind of just be by herself. Guy ends up asking her to come over, and she finds him sleeping in his little space over by this pond, and she goes in, and Guy's a little hesitant to go in himself, but she gets him to come out into the water, and he doesn't know how to swim. So Ivy, exactly the way that Tristan did when he was teaching Ivy to swim, she teaches him just at least to walk in the water and to get settled into the water. And he does try to go under, and he has a panic attack, and so she kind of helps him through that. And then that night when Ivy's home, there is this tapping outside the window, and Beth immediately panics because she thinks it's her dream, because her dream specifically was that Gregory was coming by, tapping, like shooting bullets through the windows, and Ivy had let him in, and it caused this catastrophic thing. So Beth thinks that she's already like living this dream, but it turns out that it's this guy Max that Danya has been kind of like possibly talking to, and he's upset because of something that happened, and so he wants to talk to Danya. And Ivy talks to Brian, who's sitting in the car that drove him there, and is like, please take him home. So Beth, though, is like, don't be fooled. He's making plans. He wants revenge, meaning that she, while they may have gotten away with something this time, Gregory's still planning. They basically had this event happen where Brian's uncle owns the skating rink, and he basically invites all of the kids to come over and, go skating and everything, and that includes Will. So there's some kind of possible problems there. Beth doesn't really seem to remember anything that happened the night before, so they end up going to the skating rink, and Chase is also there, who is the guy that Beth kind of had a thing for, but maybe not. It's starting to seem like she's not really as interested, but I don't know if that's because she's got this like massive amount of like anxiety surrounding around the feeling of Gregory possibly being back. Ivy then asks about Will, because it's been, several days since she and Will broke up, and she's like, I love him as much as I love you, and you know that. Please don't pull away. And Beth says that he's doing okay. She's doing okay. And then they start talking about Kelsey and Brian, who, Kelsey being Beth's cousin, Brian being the really creepy guy. And they both kind of talk about how the relationship between the two of them is similar to what there was between Gregory and Susanna, where, they would bicker and they would fight, and they would kind of be on and off again for several weeks, and like you never knew whether or not they were really together or not, because it was this game of like cat and mouse. Then eventually they decide to take a break for some ice cream. Ivy gets a call from Guy, and she's like, hey, I'm out with friends, let's meet up tomorrow, something along those lines. And then when she comes back, they start talking again about Guy and the fact that, nobody really knows who he is, and Will kind of gets some digs in about the fact that he's been, trying to look up for this guy and see like if there's anything actually possibly wrong with him, like if he's committed any crimes and if there's been any accidents that he may have been involved in. And Ivy gets really, really pissed about it. Brian catches up to her, and he kind of tries to sweet talk her and all these things, and she's like, you don't have to use me to get to Kelsey if that's what you think. And he's like, you think that's all I was trying to do, get to Kelsey? Yes. And he says, okay, I'll play along with you on that. I can pretend that I'm madly in love with Kelsey and see no other girl but Kelsey. And essentially saying that he actually really has eyes for Ivy, which is also similar to what Gregory did when he was alive. He kind of was like, yeah, I'll say that I'm trying to go after Susanna, but I'm actually like more interested in you. And it's got this massive Gregory like filled idea that I'm just like I feel my skin crawl again, just like I did with Gregory in the original trilogy. Whether or not that's because Gregory has placed himself into Brian, I don't have any idea. It would be a pretty convincing theory, though. And that's basically where we end with that section. So, in terms of my enjoyment, I think I'm not liking this as much as I did the original trilogy. And there's a couple reasons as to why. I feel like it's really fucking stupid of Ivy to trust Guy so quickly. I do not know why or how that is even actually realistically possible for somebody to trust somebody like Guy that quickly. And like, I understand that Ivy's been through a lot and she is seeing a lot of similarities with Guy and Tristan, but still, I'm sitting here and I am more so siding with Will and Beth, where I'm like, you're being fucking dumb. You don't know who this guy is. You don't know anything about him. You haven't even like really looked into anything about what happened to him in his accident or where he's from. You're literally thinking with your heart and not your fucking head, which is very much swoony. And I will say the scenes with Guy are very swoony and like they do make your heart kind of happy and fluttery, but for God's sake, like, have some common sense about this whole thing. I don't understand how she can be so fixated on this thing with Tristan to the point where she doesn't even, like, have any common sense. Now, I understand that with Will, like, it's hard for her to, like, be willing to be in a much more loving relationship with him. But at this point in their relationship, if they've been together for, I'm gonna say probably anywhere between 6 to 9 months, I would hope that by that point, you would figure out whether or not you actually want to be with this person or if you are kind of stringing them along. So some of the logic within this just doesn't make sense to me, and it's kind of frustrating in some ways, but it's still fairly enjoyable. It's just, I don't think it's going to live up at all to what the original trilogy was. So I'm kind of thinking it's going to be more of a 3-star. It's not by any means like absolutely terrible. I just don't think that there's much logic going into at least this first book. Now, I don't know if the other 2 books in this second part of the series are going to be at all the same. We'll get done with this and then I'll come back with some final thoughts and talk about what the ending of this was. We'll see ultimately how the end of this ends up being. Hey guys, so it's a little bit later in the day. It is currently 4:57. So let's go over the last 64 or so pages of this book. So again, I think I'm going to end up giving it a 3-star. I just felt like even with the last so long, there was some common sense brought up, but there is a reveal that kind of does explain a lot of stuff, which I'll get to in a second. But first, let's go through chapter 20. Ivy goes back to Guy's place, and essentially they just kind of sit and talk, and she keeps helping him learn how to swim. They kiss, and she kind of gets a confirmation that the kind of kiss that they have is the one Tristan gives her. This kiss is so similar to Tristan's that she has no doubt in her mind that this is Tristan. Then in the next chapter, Ivy's mom and younger brother come out to visit for a little while, and then Guy calls her and she says that she was thinking of a lot of stuff. There is something basically wrong. Guy can tell there's something wrong with her on the phone because she starts tearing up and she can't really say anything of what is going on. Basically what ends up being is that it's the 25th of June, which is the 1-year anniversary of Tristan's death. And that night, everybody, Will, Beth, they were going to go to the beach to perform the memorial service for him. And so she invites him thinking that, you know, it would be a comfort. And plus, because this guy already is very much like Tristan, it might, you know, bring something up in a sense. And then when she goes to leave, Kelsey and Donna come by and they're like, hey, Will invited us to this thing. We kind of wanted just to go out and do something, and so he invited us. And at first, Ivy's really kind of put off by that, but she's like, well, I'm inviting Guy, so I guess it's not that big of a deal, although Willa would not be happy to see Guy. They get down there and they start preparing for the fire, and Guy shows up with a bouquet of lavender roses, which, if you know anything about this series, the very beginning scene of the first book is essentially, there's this tidbit where Tristan had brought lavender roses, which are Ivy's most favorite flower ever. And so it's very, very clear to her that Guy has to be Tristan somewhere deep down in him, because there's no way he would have known otherwise, that she loved lavender flowers. Will gets really kind of upset about the whole thing. He's not, like we know, a big fan of Guy at all. And they start sharing stories about Tristan, and they break out a photo album. And Donna's the one that sees a picture with Gregory in it, and she kind of is like, oh, who's that? And Ivy says that that's Gregory, and they all know that Gregory was the murderer, but they never seen a picture of him. And so they're kind of like, wow, we would have never expected that that guy would have been the murderer. He looks too good to be the murderer. And then they start talking about Tristan and, you know, how loving he was, and how Philip was kind of the one to love him first before Ivy ever did, because Tristan kind of made him comfortable when it came to the wedding, and kind of just made him laugh when he was in a really, really bad spot when Ivy and Philip's mother had got remarried to Gregory's dad. And then Kelsey decides to leave, and Beth decides to go with her, and the whole thing kind of breaks apart, so they all decide to head out for the night. Will and Ivy in chapter 22 put out the fire, and she goes with them as opposed to going with Guy. Then she decides to go back to that place later on that night, and Guy is still there. He says he gets this kind of idea that she's gonna go back, she's gonna go there, I have to meet her there. He's apologized for the lavender roses, thinking it may have been a step too far, and she says, no, it's okay. And he asks about how Tristan died, and she tells him, and tells about essentially Gregory. If you remember, the reason he tries to kill Ivy is because he thinks that Ivy had seen Gregory trying to kill his mother, and so he thought that she was kind of in the way and that she was going to essentially out him, and so he tried to kill her before she could say anything. But the thing was Ivy didn't actually see Gregory killing his mother. She just had seen her dead, essentially. She ends up staying the night with Guy and wakes up the next morning. They hightail it back to the inn, and Will and Beth and Kelsey and Donna are all there because they were up worried sick about Ivy, and all of them are kind of pissed at her. And nobody talks to her really for the next day, and then she gets stopped by Will and Beth at one point. They basically are like, dude, you're going fucking crazy. This is not like you. This guy is acting in every way like Gregory did to get you, like, to close to him before he tried to kill you. What are you doing? Like, they're really genuinely concerned because this is something that they've been through before that they know isn't right. And Ivy is just basically like, you guys don't know anything. I don't understand why you don't like him. He's not gonna hurt me, all these things, which is exactly what she said about Gregory. Chapter 23, then, they end up kind of going their separate ways, and there is this festival that happens in town that Guy goes with Ivy to, and they separate at one point so that Ivy can go talk to Beth and Max, and Guy is at a burger stand getting food, but then Ivy sees that he gets into some kind of altercation with this dark-haired woman that she doesn't know, and she thinks she hears the name Luke, which at first she's like, oh, maybe that's his name because they still don't know who this guy is. Then Ivy takes it upon herself to start looking up Lukes in the area that might have gone missing, but doesn't come up with anything. So she just decides to put it away, not think about it. Ever since like that moment where he got into that altercation, he kind of seemed distant, he was upset, and he doesn't really like talk about why he's upset. But then in chapter 24, she finds Beth, who is working with the Ouija board, and she's saying, answer, answer, give me your answer. And basically it spells out Gregory is here. The planchette moves across the board spelling out Gregory is here. And then the door rings, Ivy goes to answer it, and it's Guy. And he's like, hey, what's going on? And she decides to go on a walk with Guy because she's freaked out. She doesn't know what's going on. She thinks it'd just be a good idea for her to go away for a little bit. They go walking down the beach at night, and she tells Guy that Beth is psychic, and that, you know, there's things that have happened to them that kind of have started to come to a head recently that they're kind of scared about. And then when Guy kind of tells her like, hey, you can tell me anything, but I understand right now you don't want to, and that's okay, he ends up going into the water by himself and is like, hey, look what I can do, I've been practicing. They have this really sweet moment where he says, if I lose you, it would have been better to drown. And then at that point, these police officers come up and they ask for Luke Mckenna. Guy takes off, which leads Ivy to believe that this guy is named Luke Mckenna. And so she gets taken into the station because they said that Luke is wanted for murder. Come to find out, the name Luke Mckenna and this gentleman, he had killed his girlfriend, had strangled his girlfriend, and has been out on the run for some time, which was actually briefly mentioned earlier in the story. They weren't sure, like when they were first talking about who Guy might actually be, they started theorizing that maybe he is this guy that went missing after having strangled his girlfriend, but they didn't know his name, they didn't know anything about what was going on. And Ivy, with that information, starts to really question her entire relationship with this guy, because she's like, oh my God, he could have just exactly been what Gregory was. Maybe he really was Gregory that had taken over his body and was gonna hurt me, all these things. And so the last chapter, she goes back to the inn and she goes to Beth and is like, I'm sorry, I didn't really know what was going on. How could I have been so blind? You've been right all along. How could I have imagined that guy was Tristan? Beth basically is like, listen, I get it. I've been able to get it from the beginning. You missed Tristan, and this guy seemed to have been everything you were wanting that Tristan was. It's so understandable that you felt this way, but what you were doing was really stupid. You went into this whole thing not really thinking at all. Ivy basically talks about how she thought that Will and Beth were acting strangely, but she realizes in reality that she was. And Ivy says, last year when Tristan came back, it was easy for him to get inside Will's mind. Will wasn't psychic like you or a believer like Philip, but Tristan got access because he and Will thought alike. In the same way, it would be easy for Gregory to get inside a murderer's mind, which is why she's basically starting to recount to Beth the idea that maybe it's not Tristan in Guy's body, but Gregory himself, the man that they've been terrified of. And at one point, she's awake for some time, and Ivy goes trailing through the cottage, and Luke, or Guy, basically scares her, and he's trying to get her to calm down. Then we get this major reveal. Guy, or Luke, is actually Tristan. So as far as we know, based on this one thing he says, which is, the first time we kissed, you were diving for a penny. I saw you lying at the bottom of the swimming pool and I thought you had drowned. I jumped in after you. And Ivy basically believes that because there's only one other person who would know that how they had had their first kiss, and that was Tristan. There was nobody else there when that had happened, so he's the only one that would know that. And so she's like, oh my gosh, it is you. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. And Tristan's like, no, it's okay. If you do stop believing, no, there's going to be nothing left but darkness for me. And essentially they realize like how much trouble they're in. But Tristan essentially says that, I don't know what happened between the time I said goodbye to you as Tristan when he had given her the kiss of life and the moment I gained consciousness as Guy, as Luke, but something terrible is going on. I feel it in the deepest part of me. And he says that essentially Luke's face is his face now. His hands are Tristan's hands and only his. But he doesn't know where Luke's spirit is. Like, Luke must have died, essentially. And he says, his mind and soul aren't in this body, and I have no knowledge of his life beyond what others tell me. The bits and pieces I've been gradually remembering are from my life as Tristan. So anything he's been remembering was his past life before he died. And he says that he remembers Gregory. He remembers how it was to come face to face with him. His gray eyes, sometimes they were cool and distant. Other times when I caught him off guard, they burned with anger. And Ivy tells him that Gregory's back, that somehow he is possibly enveloped himself in somebody else as well, and that Ivy is very likely in danger again. And Ivy's like, I'm really sorry I didn't believe you because literally everything was stacked against you. You came at the worst time when you came to see me earlier because Beth had the whole thing with the planchette that said Gregory is here, and then he showed up. And so immediately Ivy was like, when they found out that he was Luke, that Gregory was inside Luke, and that was not the case. Tristan has to run off in the body of Luke Mckenna because Luke Mckenna is still wanted for murder, and nobody knows that Luke Mckenna is actually now Tristan. And that basically is where we end the story of Evercrossed, is Tristan running off and Ivy having to deal with the police that are there because they tracked Luke back to the inn where they figured he would go because of Ivy. Like I said before, the consistency of the story was kind of hit or miss. I felt like the logic of the story was a little hit or miss as well. It did get itself kind of righted around where we had Will and Beth, like I said earlier, confronting Ivy and being like, you're being fucking stupid. What are you doing? So there was that, which was very nice. The problem was, though, was I felt like Ivy should have known that a lot better. Ivy should have been able to recognize this pattern she was having, but unfortunately for this young woman, love blinds her so much. And I do think that it's interesting to see the fact that Tristan has been able to essentially put his soul into another body in order for him to have another life. I'm just curious as to how exactly that was possible, because there are going to be some major repercussions of that, because as we've heard from Lacey at least twice in this book, anything that Tristan has done in order to be with Ivy has been pretty detrimental to his soul. Like, the fact that he gave her the kiss of life in the first place was a big no-no. And now that we know that his soul is in the body of another person that had died and he's able to live again, that could cause some major problems as well with the man upstairs, basically, because that's not supposed to happen. My battery died just as I was trying to finish up that, and I don't have my other battery with me currently. But basically all I was going to say was, you know, the last 2 books of this story are going to really kind of showcase those issues that have come up with Tristan basically going against the plan of God or whoever is out there. And I'm curious to see if I like the other 2 books in this series better, because so far this is the least favorite of the 6 books that are in the series, because I just felt like I said, Ivy's lack of ability to really like see the error of her ways and understand that what she was doing was not smart at all doesn't fit her character, considering, you know, what we saw in the last couple books. Like, yes, she did go through the same thing with Gregory where she trusted him and all those things, and that's, I think, why it irritates me so much, is because she knows that already, has experienced that already. Why would she not pick up the signs of that with this new relationship she was building with Guy / Luke / Tristan? It's a bit of a disappointing thing to see that there is a book in this series that is not consistently as good as the other ones, but it's still a 3-star because it wasn't awful. I still was swooning so much over some of the scenes with Guy / Luke / Tristan. I swooned over the fact that Will is this unrequited love interest who I honestly think deserves so much more than Ivy. I think that he deserves somebody so much better than that, and I'm pretty sure by the end of it he gets his own happy ending, but I don't know with who. And it just breaks my heart because I want him to be happy because he's such a sweet guy. He really cares for Beth and for Ivy, and it's just, it breaks your heart to see such a good guy go through so much pain and turmoil, especially since he already knows that the deck is stacked against him, and the fact that Ivy is still in love with Tristan even after he's been dead now for almost a year. And it's just really heartbreaking to see somebody have that up against them, because there's no way that they would ever be able to compare with Tristan, but he tries so hard to, and it's almost what kind of kills him in a way. And it's just so heartbreaking, but I do still like this quite a bit. It's just, I feel like I said, the logistics of some of the actions of Ivy was not really that believable to me based on what I know of her already by this point. So if you guys have read this book yourself, let me know what your thoughts were down in the comments below. I would love to hear them. And stay tuned for my other reading vlog reviews of the last 2 books in this series. We're coming to the end of it, and I'm kind of sad because I didn't expect this to fly by as much as it has. I think maybe because I read the first 3 fairly quickly back to back that I didn't get the chance to let this kind of get spaced out like Thirst was, or the Morganville Vampires, or anything like that. So this is kind of getting to a point where now that I have 2 books left, I'm kind of sad. I'm more sad than I think I normally would be, because this is a very well-beloved series, and I kind of wish I would have spent a little bit more time with it, but didn't end up really being the case, unfortunately. And if you guys did like this video, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.